Welcome, everybody, to Let's Talk Computer Science, a podcast dedicated to talking about the past, present, and future of computer science. This podcast is made possible by our friends at Rex Academy. Be sure to check out their amazing CS platform, including courses on cybersecurity, app development, and everybody's hot word topic of the year, AI. Don't have a teacher? Not a problem. Rex Academy is now providing instructors as part of their platform, so be sure to check them out at rex.academy. Today on the show, I'm excited to have Jed Stefanowicz. Got that right?
Perfect.
Yes. He does a little bit of everything. I'm going to let him come on and kind of share some of his background, but I've had the pleasure of knowing Jed over the last couple of years. He's done some work with EdTech Teacher, which he and I both have a lot of familiarity with. We both published to the same author, X Factor Edu. Shout out to X Factor. Woohoo!
What up?
And Matt Joseph's group. So Jed, tell us a little bit first of what do you do? What do you do for a living, and what's your kind of angle on CS before we get into your backstory?
Sure thing. I'm a digital learning coach in real life. Jed Stefanowicz rhymes with Bananowitz, so you got it. Nice job.
Bananowitz.
Yeah, there you go. I'm a digital learning coach, so I taught third grade for 20 years and then shifted into this role of digital learning coach. And really my job is, really job embedded, both for students, teachers in the building, and I like that. I really always try to reinforce that coaching part of the title so that it's not operational support. It's truly instructional support to hopefully elevate teaching that's going on in the building with technology beyond just computer science. So I was that kid in third grade who was needed the stuff that I try to bring into the classrooms. Like that's one of those greatest tricks as a teacher is to find yourself in the building, see yourself as the learner, figure out what their need is, and identify with that. So I know what I would have been like in third, fourth, fifth grade. So I know what some of those kids that I see, and it might be kids who are finished with a lesson halfway through and are needing something more, or just maybe non-traditional methods. So I've kind of built in this DLC role some of the tools and approaches that I think are, and I've seen have been effective to try to engage kids in learning, whether it's math and ELA work, or if it's truly robotics and coding and how those things coexist. So that's kind of my background. And yes, we run into each other at conferences and we do a lot of the same stuff, but we're usually in parallel rooms presenting. So we don't get to see each other present much, but so it's great to actually sit down and get to talk to. So I appreciate it.
Even if it's remote, it's still fun. Tell me before we get into your backstory. Now I'm curious about this digital learning coach because we had similar-ish positions in my district too. And it sounds like you've kind of was it a new position when you took over? Were you able to kind of create some of your job description, or obviously they have a job description when you apply for the job, but have you seen it like even in the last? I guess when did you start doing that role? Because pandemic probably had some effect on this too.
A massive
and
effect.
Then how's it evolved?
Yeah, the timing was unique, and it was one of those things like across our industry. There's a discussion of all right, there's so many buildings are one-to-one. There's so many devices, so many robots coming in the building, but that alone has not changed fundamentally a lot of instruction. That's like a Justin Reich thing, right? We were poised for the revolution, and yet it didn't happen. If there was ever one thing that would have proven it, it would have been a pandemic. And we saw how that rolled out and all the bad practices that came in and all the personalized learning that we've been trying to espouse for so long just kind of fell apart, and everyone had to reinvent. So, where we were poised for, I think, effective coaching conversations just had to pause. And we had to become operational support. So within my district, you're asking about my position. It's interesting because in order to create a full-time digital learning coach at every elementary, which is pretty rare around us.
That is rare. It's rare in the country. Yeah.
Yeah. But part of that was removing tech support building by building. So I am also, so that means bulbs, projectors, toners, that's also in my purview, and those things I write about. I'll be quiet in my district, but I write about that. Those two things work against each other. They undercut each other. If you're trying to establish a culture of coaching and instructional practice and that kind of reflective piece, it's hard when that same person also sees you or needs you as their equipment manager, right? It's that coach manager thing. And the fact is both need to happen. And when one person is doing both, it's not that they're in conflict, it's just they're two very different things. And the relationship you're trying to build from an instructional coaching point of view, it's harder to gain traction, the more often you're in there to reconnect things at the beginning of the year or be just frontline tech support. And they're both needed highly. So it's tricky when one person's trying to do both. And the
Yeah.
fact is, for some people, for some staff, it's a different role for different people, and that's kind of the craft of coaches. And it's, everyone who's kind of in that role or a similar role, we talk about, well, what's the difference between a tech integration specialist, right? I'm not on a schedule where kids come to me. I'm in classrooms as much as possible, but it's truly from a co-teaching model, and that's
Right.
critical. I'm not coming in and doing a lesson where a teacher's in the back correcting papers and they're
Right.
saying, "Can you come back next September and do the same thing?" That's the thing we've had to work against, and that's the model in a lot of places.
Yeah, I wonder. Going back on that, first of all, I like that the psychology you just described there is absolutely correct. Because with my own team, I would always tell them, and we had one on every campus too. But we also had tech support. But tech support was kind of roaming; they weren't always necessarily assigned. So I would always say, "Hey, give it 5 minutes, and if you can't do it, then put in a ticket
Yep.
and have someone come." So I mean, turning on and turning off the projector, things like that. But you're right, psychologically, what that says to the end user or the person you're trying to make the relationship with is, this is the person that helps me fix things, not necessarily the person that helps me fix pedagogically what I'm
Yeah,
doing, but
it's a tricky
yeah,
dynamic, and luckily I've been a 26-year educator. If if someone comes up through the IT ranks and tries to move into that coaching role, I think you're just dead in the water. I think if you're an experienced teacher and you know that this is assessment week and someone says get out, I don't take that personally. Or
yeah,
someone says, or they say it's assessment week, I need these Chromebooks
need
to
you
be
now.
working, I need it. Yeah, then
Yeah,
I also appreciate that. So there's a respect, but you just can't front load a lot of that. You have to discover that and establish that. And what helps is being an educator. We're talking the same language. It's not about the operation, it's about the instruction. It's not about the products, it's about the practice. And that's a really critical piece, is to have that conversation always be about the instructional practices, not the products they're using. Therefore, I'm not a trainer. It's really, from a pedagogy point of view.
yeah. I think it was Brianna Hodges who told me once. She's like, training is what you do to a horse or a dog. You train animals, right? You're coaching, which is a totally different experience. Yeah, you're getting them excited about the process, and like you're talking about the procedure and the practice. Let's back up a little bit though. Let's talk about your
Sure.
origins. So harken back to your early days. Wow, it could have been as a teacher. You and I have been around education almost the same amount of time. I came in '98, so you'd have been about what, '96 ish.
Exactly.
Yeah. So computer science, using technology to learn, looked different back then. And then probably before that, did you have any access to, or was there ever a moment, I guess, a light bulb moment where you're like, this is kind of neat. This might actually work, help with learning. Like you said, you identified well with those struggling third graders. Was there a moment in your history that could kind of bear that out?
Yeah, I was interesting. My dad was a computer science professor, still is, just
Oh,
recently
so it's in the
retired,
family.
and it's in the family. But never, I was not, I never came up through a computer science point of view. I was an Atari kid. I was not
Me
a
too.
Commodore 64 kid.
Oh, I
Like,
also had that.
so you kind of straddled both,
I
right? And you
try to
could
do
tell,
both. Yeah, yeah.
yes. And I was that kid who, yes, we were able to take, some of the early things home and attach them to our TVs with a little switcher and, all those things.
Yes.
Uh, and it was just very interesting to me, but it wasn't like I didn't totally geek out on it, but it definitely spoke a language to me that, um, this is who I am. This is stuff that's just of interest to me, and I think that's a really big piece. And I knew in teaching that would be the case. I had the one internet drop was in my classroom, and it was, I think a Netscape thing, and I had a
Yeah.
2E in my classroom, or a Mac LC2, the one that looked like a pizza box.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
and then very quickly, it's been amazing in our time period to see where we've come to and where we are, and the problems we cry about now. Oh, it took 3 seconds for my email to load. You're not
Yeah.
dialing it, so it's all very relative. But I was the teacher who was also bringing a lot of new things into my classroom. Right, we're the early adopters, which some administrators don't get it, but some administrators really appreciate it too, because we're trying things and we're seeing how it engages all kids, and engaging all learners, but more importantly, capturing all their voices. And that's where we're at with the tools now. It's literally from an equity point of view too. It's beyond the question of, are you hearing every kid's voice in the class? We learn that as early teachers. When you go home, are there voices you didn't hear? But beyond
Right.
that, how are we capturing those voices? how are we amplifying those voices? How are we curating that thinking through those voices? Could be student podcasts, which I'm doing with first and second, all the way up to fifth graders, but it also could just be publishing differently, thinking about book creator and breaking out of the idea of print as publishing, or as the main way of publishing.
Right.
One of my next projects, I think, is going to be called Beyond the Bulletin Board. And it's not a knock on what we put on those bulletin boards, it's how can we enhance them. Is it a QR code that goes to content that explains the bulletin board? Is it going
Augmented reality.
deeper? And
Yeah.
yeah, totally. And you know who those kids are in the classroom who you'd target and say, take this iPad, walk around the room, record the learning that's going on, show this process so that when you have that bulletin board, you have all this other content that's aligned with it too. And those are the kids who would have been probably you and me in fourth grade who would have loved that job, give that purpose, right? And it's having that authentic purpose, giving every kid that authentic audience too, and then understanding the tools that we're using. And that kind of folds into a little bit with my vision of CS is that, I think it's insulting to kids or condescending to kids when there's something that says they're learning coding without realizing it. Like if I see that in a catalog, I think what a backwards approach because it
Yeah.
should be completely explicit what kids are doing and why. Or even sometimes I get, that question of, well, how does this fit into the curriculum? To which I want to shout, well, this is the curriculum. This is what we're learning.
Right.
We don't have to turn a Bebop activity into a math lesson. We don't have to fit it elsewhere. That's a scheduling problem. That's not a learning problem. Um, and we just need to be more explicit about the tools we're using, why we're using them, what the learning is, and then how is that captured and shared.
I think, and that's kind of hitting on my next question because you work with elementary, correct?
Yes, K to 5.
Yeah, K to 5. So, one of the challenges I've seen a lot is that, Hour of Code is great and it was a great start, but I feel like sometimes that's it, right? Like, well, we've got all the other stuff to get through. And you were just saying that, like, yeah, it's a one-off or it's its own little thing with the B-bots and all that. But, how do we embed it? How do you overcome that challenge of getting teachers to realize that it's not just like it's one, technology, not just this one-off thing?
And honestly, you're lucky if it is even a one-off thing because
That's
teachers are
true.
so
Yeah.
they're
Let's
afraid
establish
of
that first.
hour of
Yeah.
code, and the reason they're afraid of hour of code is because when they try it within 10 minutes, kids pass by their ability for the teacher to help them. They're like, I don't know how to solve level 4 of that,
Yeah.
code.org puzzle, which is awesome for kids to be
Yeah.
put in that productive struggle moment, but it's a real vulnerable place for a teacher. And by the time they're third, fourth, or fifth grade, the kids in the class have more expertise, more content knowledge from a true mechanical view, more content and technical knowledge than their teachers do. And there's never been a time that really that's been the case. And as a result, that pedagogical knowledge from like the TPAC model isn't there for the teacher. So some will just skip it. And others who don't love that struggle and are okay to be able to say to their class, I don't know how to solve this. Let's figure it out together. That's like a
Yeah.
magic moment, but
Oh,
that's
yeah.
not in everyone's wheelhouse, right? So one of my more recent blog posts was called Minute 61. What do you do after the hour of code? Because if it's just in
I
isolation,
like that.
like, and that's, we hear from some of our common friends, like Brian Aspinall is always talking about hour of code. It's awesome as an intro. It's awesome as a highlight. It's awesome. And I agree because it brings attention to computer science. But if it's just an hour, if it's just a week, what are you saying about the rest of the year? Then we slip back into, oh, it's 2 o'clock Tuesday, time for technology. Like that model that I feel like my career is now trying to break that model and really embed any technology, whether it's, reading support services or whether it's true computer science or physical computing with makey makeys, like that's all part of a general curriculum. And that computational thinking within code, where coding is just a portion of that, to me, that's as critical of a classroom competency as any of the other 4 C's. So communication, collaboration, critical thinking, creativity.
Yep.
We've been talking about that for 23 years. It's 21st
Yes.
century learning, right?
Yes.
So my contention is there's a 5th C, and that 5th C is computational thinking. And coding is a way, but so is Wordle. So is,
Right.
anything that is really that analytical thinking, that sequential thinking, the decomposition. I don't need to teach you about computational thinking, but you know what I mean. It's the things that teachers are already doing in their classrooms that they may not view as foundational thinking for either computer science, computational thinking. Are you classifying? Are you sequencing? Are you giving directions in the room? Are you doing something already with secret codes? If you are, you're building language.
That
And
like, yeah.
I'm not a coder. I'm a teacher. And if you can kind of have that shift in thinking about how can a teacher, how can an everyday student think about opportunities to enhance and support that computational thinking, that's where I'm all about.
Yeah, I think that word code maybe throws them off. I think
Yeah,
going to the
totally.
angle of computational or and even computational or critical thinking, which is what we're kind of seeing now with the prompt engineer model of Chat
I know,
GPT. Like,
right?
how do we now create these prompts? And now elementary kids, by terms of service, aren't allowed to have access to Chat GPT. But I'm curious, have you seen any teachers utilize it? Have you seen what are some ways you've seen it being used in the classrooms? And there's lots of AI models. I know that's just like the number one top one, so we'll hit that one. But
Right. Yeah. And we'll talk briefly about it because everyone else is talking about it too. And by
right,
the time this airs, there's going to be, ChatGPT
72
5 will
more.
be out there.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, but it is fascinating. It's cool. It's fun to explore. And yes, we see, we know the names of the people we're going to find on Twitter who are doing really cool things and saying, here's 12 awesome applications to try with your class. And they are the ones who will ask forgiveness, not permission. But they will also be using good teaching,
right.
and they'll be using strong case uses that can almost, I think, be a good defense about people who immediately overreact the other direction. Right?
Yeah.
You've got the extremists both ways. This is the beginning of Skynet, or this is, you know,
Always
or,
Skynet. Always
I know,
Skynet.
always Skynet, or it's the greatest thing ever. It's probably somewhere in between, right? And it may be both, but maybe subtly not quite the extremes. But I think what's most fascinating to me is how fast it's advancing, how awesome it is, how it gets people thinking differently and talking differently about, bad habits in our profession. And the fact is, this is the worst it's ever going to be. It's only going to get better. It's only going to get faster, which is crazy to think about. And I do think, I don't know if it'll fundamentally change the way we teach, because nothing yet um, has fundamentally shifted the way we're teaching as much as those of us who are like
Yeah.
dying for change, right? If we've learned nothing else, how gradual change is. And it's also very personal and it's very incremental. And that's the thing about that professional learning versus professional development. It's got to be personal, incremental, if it's going to stick, if it's going to hold, and it's also going to be effective for learning. And the early adopters need to make a strong case for everyone else as to how it's safe, how it's effective, but also what's the real value beyond the novelty.
I think that's what we fall into sometimes too. We see the new shiny toy, we
Yep.
splash it everywhere, and in this case, it was like immediately it was a disparate argument. Half the
Hmm.
people were like it's evil and should go away, and the other half were like it's just a flashy new thing. But now it seems like the conversation nationally, I don't know if you're picking up on this too. It's like it's over the last few months. I think the fear factor has come down, which I think is just our natural reaction to anything new. And now it's more like, okay, now let's actually see, can we put this to practice? Is there something valuable we can get out of
Yep.
it? Which is good. This is where I think the real meat of the conversation that you and I have been trying to get to have with teachers all over the world. I think that's what we want to make happen. Let me ask you this. So I always said this to my team. I said, if you're doing your job really well, you kind of coach yourself out of a job because the teachers will be able to be, totally independent, fully well knowing, by the way, that teachers don't have the time in the day to do a lot of the
Of
stuff that we're
course.
doing. We're
Yep.
kind of an extension for them. Um, you look forward to your last day on this current job. Let's say, okay, it's your last day, you're about to retire, and you're looking back. How do you know that you made a difference? Like, what are the things that you think about in your head? Because it's always tough when you're not in a classroom to have, like with kids, I always felt like, oh, they'll reach out to me and I'll talk to them and I'll know I made a difference. But when you're working with teachers a lot of the time, which you do most of the time, and kids, of course, you're coaching in the classroom. How do you look back and say, I made a difference?
That's a really good question. I like that. I've asked a lot of questions and been asked a lot of questions, but one that never puts it like that, because that really gets to the why, like gets to my personal vision. I've spent a lot of the past year putting together something that's either uh, I share it at workshops, or it was a blog. It might be a piece of another writing, but it's really formulating this kind of a thought structure of three domains of digital learning. And those three domains are wellness, competency, creativity. Everything kind of falls into one of those three. And I think for a district that's either moving really well along with technology, or a district that's saying, okay, next year we need to pay attention and we really want to boost up our digital learning. not technology, digital learning. So it's about
Right.
student learning. I think those three domains are the place to start. So the wellness, and wellness beyond just digital citizenship. Digital citizenship is a slice,
That's
but
part of it.
wellness, we're talking about the devices, we're talking about the relationships, talking about those conversations of, our kids, on TikTok at midnight, and then whose job is that the responsibility of parents, educators, guidance, health? Well, when you have a wellness point of view, everyone says it's all of our
It's all of
responsibility.
us. Yeah.
When it's locked into digital citizenship, it's more like, well, who's deploying that conversation?
Yeah. Good
So,
point.
from a wellness point of view, I think that piece is really important. I think the competency piece is that's the capacity of your educators and kids in the building to operate. And then the creativity piece, that's where our jam is. That's how are we
Yeah.
capturing voice? Um, how are kids shining? How are kids engaged? How are kids feeling motivated? And how are the tools being used? So none of these are training. So I guess my evaluative piece at the end would look at those three domains. How's a district poised now at this point? How have they grown in student wellness? How have they grown as the competencies within the building and the capacity of the learners and the educators to use the tools for strong pedagogy? And then the creativity piece is, how are you capturing that? How are you, when you walk in a building, is it the same bulletin boards you've always seen? Do you have, just someone kind of, who are the people in the building who we've always called them pockets of innovators, but
Yeah.
who are the people who are bringing new things, getting kids excited about learning? So it's shifting that from always operational to instructional. And that would be my pieces. How am I leaving this school? Have I been able to really find observable, measurable growth in those three domains: wellness, competency, creativity?
And you honestly just also answered the question I used to tell when my staff would say, like, what do you mean we're coaching ourselves out of a role? I'm like, well, in those three domains, everything's changing so frequently that you almost have to have someone like a steward of those domains, someone that's kind of
Yes.
captaining the ship to keep it going forward. So I think in some ways you'll never really you'll always have a role, that's for sure.
Yep.
Where can people find out more about you and your great work?
Sure. So I just published my second book called Impact to Influence, and it's
I've not had a
two.
chance to read that one. I saw Taking Aim, but yeah,
Yeah.
I haven't checked out your new one yet.
So take aim at digital learning. That's really kind of a how-to for this whole conversation. Activate, innovate, motivate digital learning, and that it's on Amazon. It's at X Factor Books or my site jedpd.com. Nice and short. But and my most recent book, Impact Influence, it was an interesting project because what I did was I found 20 people whose stories I've kind of studied or known or have been leaders to me personally, and I really wanted to just capture what was their journey. It's the subtitle is Pathway Portraits of Risk Takers, Rule Breakers, and Change Makers. So people like yourself, where how did you move from being a classroom teacher to doing all these other things and impacting 20 kids at a time now to impacting hundreds, or at a local, state, national level, building that. And it's not for everyone, and some people
Right.
have tried it and moved back and said this is not for me. Other people, it's their calling, and there's something that drives them to not just buy the equipment that you're looking at, but also, like, you have an audience. How did you build that? So the structure of the project, which I call it a project more than a product, you read 4 or 5 pages about Carl Hooker, and then there's a QR code, and that just goes to a 20-minute Zoom conversation. So the world doesn't need another podcast, because there are people like you doing better ones than I ever could.
We have plenty.
But what I wanted to do was kind of put the podcast format into a book, because everyone can talk about themselves on a Zoom now. It's not a big ask, and I want people to really share their stories from their points of view. And I didn't want to give people a chance to rattle off their accomplishments. I really wanted to say, yeah, 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 I know, I've seen you on
Right,
stage.
right. Got the bio. Yeah.
Yes. So tell us about, and my questions were kind of pointed that way. What is it about you? Kind of like yours about that backstory, but what is it that made you want to do this? Who was that interesting person along the way? And really just capturing, how did you move from that impact to influencing larger? So that's the structure of that book. I'm on Twitter at Stefanowicz135. JedPD.com is a really easy way to find me. I love talking to teachers, talking to schools, sharing my ideas. And then StefanowiczClass.blogspot.com. My blog is called Jed Talks. I thought I was clever ripping off the TED Talks logo,
Yeah, yeah.
It looks awesome, but apparently there's also other guys named Jed who have had the same idea. So
Apparently.
if you're searching Jed Talks, just be careful what you find.
Oh, good little disclaimer there as we talk about
Yes.
digital wellness. Well, thank you, Jed, for sharing your story with us today. And thank you for being a part of the Let's Talk Computer Science podcast. And again, thanks to our friends at Rex Academy for making this podcast possible. Be sure to check out their work at their platform, rex.academy. We all know technology will be a part of our future. As educators and leaders, it's our role to make sure that all our students have an opportunity in that future as well. This is Carl Hooker signing off.